I wanted to make these videos because I watch what's happening online in a number of cases where a tremendous of emotional energy that's being repressed in the culture bubbles up and gets funneled and amplified, uh, sometimes very destructively, towards individuals over specific remarks in or out of context. And it seems probable, based on what I'm seeing, that at some point, some of this energy that's bubbling and fermenting in the culture and doesn't have a clear and healthy outlet may get funneled towards me. There's also the possibility that as I develop different roles throughout my life, that things from the past, largely things I've been making videos about over the past few years, would be brought into the present and create a tension or a question of how does present-day Dane relate to past Dane? How does this word in the past relate to this word in the future? And so I wanted to talk to that in general terms here, and then make a few videos to explain what I feel and think about controversial topics. So the first thing I want to say is that context is everything when it comes to communication. And in that way, making media like on a YouTube video is both toxic and medicinal, depending on how it's applied. And what makes something toxic is taking something that's already out of balance and leaning heavily in a certain direction, and then behaving or speaking in such a way that rather than helping that particular dynamic move towards balance and symmetry and integration, that it becomes more unbalanced. So most of us have the good sense when someone has just lost their husband or wife and is weeping and feeling alone and helpless and feeling, like maybe there's something they could have done to prevent the death, that's not the ideal time to share a list of all the things they could have done to prevent the death. On the other hand, if that same spouse or person is through a grieving period and has kind of erased a lot of the grief, etc., with the illusion that there's absolutely nothing they could have done, particularly if there's a pattern of activity that contributed to the death, giving an alcoholic drinks, etc., that it might well be medicinal in that moment to, if they're in complete denial, leaning heavily this side, to try and help them come to a point where there's a balanced and constructive perspective. Now, a balanced and constructive perspective results in actions that someone is capable of doing that generate well-being and minimize suffering. A constructive perspective is not a perspective that takes up a lot of time, that on things that an individual can do nothing about, and or are way over their limit. They can do something, but to give them 10 tons of weight when they can carry 50 pounds in their current capacity is just as disabling as giving them absolutely nothing to carry. So there is a, in an evolving culture, in an evolving relationship, there are many points on every continuum that are out of balance and that lead to unnecessary suffering. And, if you look at it, to give an example of, just some of these many fulcrums, if you're, overwhelmed with debt so that you're sitting and vegging out and watching TV 15 hours a day because it's overwhelming, you could say that's a dissociation that's highly destructive. And on the other hand, if you're overwhelmed with debt and you're working yourself into an adrenaline frenzy, a cortisol frenzy in which you can barely cope and which is damaging your health because you're trying to pay off $1 million debt, making $10 an hour overnight, that's not going to do something, anything good either. And so it's this regulating point of finding a balance point where you're taking the incremental steps that you can in a direction that reduces unnecessary suffering, preferably evidence-based. I mean, going out and racking up credit card debt to alleviate anxiety because you're in so much debt may feel good for a few minutes, but it's not an evidence-based protocol that works, because then you're that much more stressed out in a few days. So when I say an evidence-based system that works, I mean that you can look at the goal, what's creating the suffering. If it's the debt that's creating the suffering, then you don't want to alleviate the suffering in a way that adds to the debt that then creates more suffering. That's a vicious circle. But if you pay off a certain amount of the debt on a daily basis and invest in skills and opportunities that will allow you to increase your earning power, which in turn is used to pay off debt, and you do that in such a way that it neither collapses your body in exhaustion, nor leaves you underperforming, that's a good balance. And it's these balance points that create well-being. And the human species, in all of our individuality, and all of the different energies that can get blocked up, you can have a situation where just about anything you say in that situation for that person is a step forward. And you can have a situation where those same words in a different situation with a different person would be toxic, would be hurtful. And so if we understand that speech is a technology and a form of directing energy, number one, and that number two, any direction of energy by definition is imbalanced a certain degree. And if you're in complete stasis and balance, you just sit here and smile in front of a camera and you have nothing to say, and you just enjoy the moment. And so that's a point of stasis. But when you say something, you're responding in the moment, in your mind or in the outer reality, to something that's out of balance. And ideally, for it to be constructive, it moves the reality a little bit closer to balance. And I use, the example of, a rapper that's cursing and swearing and I don't know, talking about prostitutes, etc. This can be medicinal for some people in some situations. And in other situations, it's toxic. And so there's a certain amount of responsibility on the part of the listener to, first of all, understand that all streams of energy have an impact, be they physical or verbal, emotional, facial, they have an impact. And, when you're completely depressed and don't have any reason to get out of bed, to look at a picture of a little girl that's been run over that day, or to have your mother call up and complain about her long litany of diseases, is not going to get you out of bed. And while there's a certain subjectivity in all of this, if you believe that getting out of bed and engaging with the things in reality that are depressing you and, removing them, then, not getting out of bed is not such a good idea. And so it's not that someone complaining is in and of itself toxic. It could be very medicinal if that person bottles things up, doesn't speak the negative side, is constantly telling themselves they should be positive when the reality is their feelings are quite painful. It's good for them to express, but it may be not good for someone who's depressed to listen to. They may need a comedy, if you follow my drift. And so it's the listener's responsibility to get a sense of where they're out of balance at that point. And it's the speaker's responsibility, as much as possible, to speak with an intention in which their words are useful in some context. And there is a context in which they are useful. There absolutely is. For example, someone, Ku Klux Klan, racist, misogynistic, filled with rage and hatred, etc. A sociologist or a therapist might learn a great deal by listening to that individual and noticing the pattern, like what really is at the core of that hatred. Because at the core of all hatred, there's always an ingredient of powerlessness. No one who feels supremely confident is filled with hate. It's that simple. Now, one can be filled with hate in one area where one feels powerless, and be filled with relaxation in another area where one feels moderately confident and survival, etc. And very joyful and excited in some other area that's where we're very competent and where we have mastery. But wherever hate is found, just as one example, an arena of powerlessness and pain and hurt are located. Now, if you understand that emotions are symptoms of an environment, that emotions are produced by our relationship with a given environment, we can learn a great deal about any environment that produces hate. We can say that this is an environment that produces hate because it induces states of powerlessness in conjunction with pain. Now, if you want less hate in the world, you don't take the batteries out of the smoke detector that's saying fire, fire, fire. You examine the reality that created the hate. Hate is not something that comes out of nowhere any more than if you want a temperature. If you want a thermometer reads the temperature. It's a symbol of the environment. And so if you want to understand and do something about a thermometer that reads 20 degrees and you want it to read 30 degrees, well, you look at what's going on in the weather that's creating this temperature. Because the thermometer is just a read of the environment in which it's located. Human emotion is just a read of the environment in which it occurs. And so, obviously, it's a much more complex algorithm than a thermometer. But nonetheless, the same principle is true. If you're hearing a screeching of a smoke detector find the fire and put it out. When you see hate groups and extreme groups, find the fire and put it out. Now, certainly there's intergenerational hate where some parent at some point became disenfranchised and felt helpless and felt enraged and blamed this person, and then this other person protected the person they were blaming, and this and that and the other, and they formed a really strong belief, that these types of people are evil, and then they teach their children that. But they recreate the wound. They say, they're evil because of this and this and this, and until they're killed and gone, the bottom line of any story is, I'm not going to be powerful and happy. Beneath the passion of hate and fear and anger and hurt, and there's always a movement towards a desire to have conscious mastery of something beautiful, of a conscious mastery of a positive state. Now, mastery is a really important thing. It ties in with control. And if we understand, it's a little bit like driving a car. Now, if you're out of control, meaning you're in the passenger seat, and the car is careening over bumps and this because nobody is in the driver's seat. So it's a horrific experience. And you're in the passenger seat. The very first step is to get into control. Once you're in control and you've got a handle on things, the next step is to figure out how to maneuver the car to reduce the suffering. So control comes first, mastery comes second, and every single person that feels a strong sense of mastery with confidence navigates things towards a place of well-being. Now, when people are using their control to navigate towards pain, it means that their control doesn't have confidence yet. It doesn't have stability. Why? Well, the need to have impact and the need for certainty. Certainty is a protection from chaos, which is a protection of the unknown, which is a protection of trauma. Control is also a protection of the unknown and trauma. When you have this sense that there are these big forces that are way bigger than you and that could just rip the rug out from under you at any point, we usually fight them. Because until we feel like we can master and have some semblance of control of those forces, we can't relax. Feeling good and feeling safe feels dangerous because it feels like a setup for the next ripping out, removing the rug. And so people who have unaddressed trauma do not feel safe because they never faced and integrated the trauma that threatened their life as they felt it and perceived it to begin with. And so they're always going to be in conflict until they develop that level of mastery. That's just the way psychology works. Now, if you understand that, and you understand that there's an intersection between the individual that creates the environment and the environment that creates the individual, and that you can say them both 100%, they're both true. The environment didn't exist until I created it, and I didn't exist until the environment created me. Both of those statements are true. They're chicken and egg type dynamics. But nonetheless, if we understand that every individual in any psychological state that's there was induced into that state by some experience in the birth canal and subsequently, just being born is a fucking big trauma. I mean, feeling a grown woman contracting all her muscles to squash and kill you, and are you going to come out alive, and those timeless moments, these are huge things that we see in hypnosis and other regressions, they're stored in the body. And you can come out of those things into the blinding white light of a hospital or room with dissociative people that are paying no attention to your awareness and be terrified. And just come into the world with a frame in which none of these people see me, understand me, and I'm not safe. So if we understand that all data that is accurately expressed is a clue to something that someone with intelligence and sophistication can use for good, and that it is also information and influence that someone can use to create harm, then we have to hold our media accountable for their intention and their loyalty. Is their intention and their loyalty to kill, traumatize, hurt, humiliate various people in order to promote their career in an adrenaline-addicted culture where they get promoted based on attention in a brain dynamic where pain, trauma, and controversy always gets 500% more attention than a headline, "Everything's fine again at so-and-so's house. Everything's fine again at so-and-so's house." Car 853 drove to work, arrived on time, and is sitting in the parking lot. That's it. Car 857 careened out of control, suspense, the this, that, the other. It's a very small minority of events, but that's the event that sells the newspapers. And so we have created a system in which advertisers pay for most of our media, and it's by media hits. And so we've linked the security of our reporters, the survival and security and reputation of our reporters, not to the well-being of the public and not to the interest of the people they are reporting on, and not to what is fair and balanced. We've linked our media's survival and stability to the ability to arouse adrenaline and cortisol and sell attention when our brains focus 500%. So 5 to 1 is the focus on the negative. And so we have this whole science of, quote, clickbait. Now, just because a reporter is going to make a $10,000 bonus or get promoted from inaccurately exaggerating a perfectly benign story into something that is going to terrorize someone's life does not make that reporter innocent of that impact, because they might just as well have made it as uncontroversial and as understandable as possible. So they could do that. They could make it as understandable as possible, and they wouldn't get promoted, and they would actually be doing fair and balanced reporting. And so we give every reporter in our current paradigm a devil's temptation. Destroy the culture of which you are a part and receive lots of money, or support the culture of which you are a part and be viewed as inconsequential and not advantageous for the person who owns the media company, who is not going to get revenue unless you get clicks and views, and who isn't going to get clicks and views for you doing fair and balanced reporting, because fair and balanced reporting is, 95% of what's going on is fine. 95% of the cars you drive by didn't hit you. 95% of the houses didn't blow up that day. 95% of the people are trying in their own way to do something decent. Now, it is a question, and it is an important one. Do we care enough about our people to create media in a way that rewards the creators of media based on the well-being that they generate, as opposed to the unnecessary viewing that they generate in order to sell products that we don't need? That is a very, very big question. We are not in that system, which makes it dangerous to speak in any public way, because with clipping and edits, everyone can be turned into a monster that doesn't exist, or a monster that does exist as a percentage. Every single human being has a positive and a negative side, certainly including myself. And you can zoom in, let's take my finger or whatever. You can find, like here, what is this little bump? It irritates me from time to time. You can just keep zooming in and keep zooming in until the whole world looks like it's that bump. And then you can say, and then you can have a frenzy of response. Oh, that's a disgusting. Oh, I've never seen it. What are they doing? Why are they? And you can have an endless frenzy. Or you can zoom back and say, wow, here's a man taking time out of life to bring coherence and intelligence to communication in our culture because he cares. And oh, he happens to have a bump on his hand. This is the responsibility of media. Now, the responsibility of the viewer is to take the time to go to a reliable source. I personally encourage everyone, anytime they do an interview with our media, in our adrenaline-addicted, frenzied, and sold to advertising culture, record the entire interview yourself, put it up on a website, and then go, look at some of the software that's being developed that measures bias. And then reflect and hold the reporter accountable for the bias they either create or the neutrality that they create, for the educational value they create, or for the adrenaline and stress they create, because that's useful. So I hope that gives a little bit of sense and context, that I use whenever I speak.